camera. Well, hi everyone. Welcome to 590Q. So Leilani is going to be doing the introductions. But before I hand it over to Leilani, just something. So today we have a speaker. We try to record those and actually post them on YouTube. So we record, the Zoom is recorded in speaker mode, which means all of us here do not appear in the recording. But if someone asks a question, then your voice will be in the recording. And same thing for people on Zoom. I think if you start talking, you might be highlighted and appear in the recording. So if you don't want to be highlighted, you can ask a question on chat. And also one thing we can do is when the talk is done, we could just stop recording and then take a few more questions after the recording is done. Then people can ask additional questions and not be on the recording. Does that sound good? But everyone's welcome to ask questions. And actually for the PhD students, what you should always strive for in talks is to ask as many questions at least as you are 5 years in the program. That's one question, and your students try to ask questions. And faculty, they just don't stop talking anyway. So all right, so Leilani, all yours for the introduction.
All right, sounds good. So it's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Alvitta Ottley. So Dr. Ottley is an assistant professor in computer science and engineering at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, with a courtesy appointment in the psychological and brain sciences department at WashU. So her research uses interdisciplinary approaches to solve problems such as how to best display information for effective decision-making and how to design human-in-the-loop analytics interfaces that are more attuned to the way people naturally think. So Dr. Ottley's received numerous awards, including the NSF CRII and NSF Career Awards, as well as the 2022 Euroviz Early Career Award and Best Paper Awards and honorable mentions at top HCI and visualization research conferences. And her talk today is on improving human-machine partnership through observational learning. Welcome, Dr. Ottley.
Thanks, Alani, and thanks for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to give. Unfortunately, I don't have food here. I see you guys are eating. So I am an assistant professor at WashU, as the other Washington, as Lenani said, and I do a lot of work, so I'm going to try my best to synthesize this work. I want to start by just saying what I mean by observational learning. So a lot of the work that I do take into consideration practices in psychology, and it's leveraging how we as people naturally learn from our environment. So without instructions, we learn how to walk, we learn how to talk. And so there are a lot of things we learn as humans by through observations. And so a lot of my work that I'm trying to do is how do I take a visual analytics system and embed it with machine learning algorithms that can also learn from observing people's interactions. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the students who do this work. These are the students in my lab. They are the ones who do most of the work, and I don't want to take credit. So I want to give credit where credit is due. But I imagine that most of you would know what visualizations are, but I like to put this slide in just for people who may not have a visualization background. So this is some artifacts from a workshop that I did with some middle schoolers. And the idea here is they wanted to understand what visualizations were. And so I told them that visualizations are tools that we use to ask and answer questions about the world. And so one of the questions we came up with as a group was trying to figure out how many red M&Ms are in a packet, and are there disproportionate amounts of M&Ms? And so we handed out M&Ms, and naturally what we realized is that the students started building visualizations with the artifacts that they had. And so this is the idea that, so in 5 minutes, they built their first visualizations. And the idea is that visualizations are all around us. Here is just a simple one where people build with M&Ms, but oftentimes the work that we do uses more complex and interactive visualizations. Generally speaking, the way I think about a visualization now is I think about it as a form of human-machine collaboration, and sometimes even as a language for the human and the machine to collaborate together. And so when I think of human-machine collaboration, there's a spectrum. So where you have human-heavy side of human-machine collaboration, that's crowdsourced computation, to the machine-heavy, and this is unsupervised machine learning. And the way I think about visualization and visual analytics is in this space. So traditionally, you have a human, they're interacting with the computer, they're using a visualization to explore the data, generate hypotheses, and make decisions. And my unique approach to thinking about human-machine collaboration is recentering it on the human. So thinking about that a single human might bring their knowledge, background, biases, personality, and their preferences. And a lot of my work has shown that all of these can impact the way people solve problems with visualizations and how they would explore an interface. So what drives my research is this idea is that to create maximally effective visualization tools, we must understand the user and her evolving analysis goals. So I'm going to try to summarize the work that I do. And I think about it in 4 categories. The first set of projects are around understanding how people perceive and make decisions with data. And this is both in the context of a static visualization. So think about someone who goes to the doctor and trying to understand their test statistics. Some of my work has looked at how might you use data visualizations to communicate complex statistics to everyday people. I also try to understand how do you model. So in more complex visual analytic environments, so think about an interactive visualization system. How do you model and capture interactions and asking what can you learn from them? And then I also think about how do you evaluate different models? So we might have different models for measuring the same thing. How do you know which one to use and under which circumstances? And then finally, with these models that can track what someone is interacting with, or that might be able to predict future actions or even their exploration bias, how might you use that to make suggestions? And then also use these platforms to ask questions around how might the suggestions that a machine algorithm make bias someone's interaction, and also ask questions around trust. So what is the role of trust in human-machine collaboration? Generally speaking, there are a wide variety of applications that we apply this work to. We look at decision-making related to text and visualizations. This is, of course, going back to the scenario that I talked about where there's a doctor and a patient making decisions. Sometimes there are some patients who just prefer text. So we asked, when is visualization even appropriate? And I also do a lot of work with the Department of Defense. And so these are situations where you might have an analyst and they might want to communicate their analysis results to someone in a managerial position. So they need to have a concise representation, and often that needs text and visualizations together. So we ask, how do you put those together in a representation, and when is text appropriate versus when is visualization appropriate? So as I mentioned, we think about also guidance in data exploration, and there's some Department of Defense applications there for that. So think about someone exploring a large data space. How do you capture what they're looking at and make sure that they're not biased to a specific subset? So how do you inform them of their biases and maybe guide them through these exploration? I also do work thinking about, I mentioned medical decision-making, and then also I collaborate a lot with people in their scientific material discovery realm, where they're trying to understand not necessarily a large data set, but high-dimensional data. And I'm gonna touch on some somewhat new stuff that we're working on at the very end. So I want to start a little bit, and I forgot to say, if you have any questions at all, feel free to stop me at any time. I'm happy to answer questions. So I'm going to start with just a little sampling of some of the work that we've done, and in terms of individual differences in problem solving. So as I mentioned, there are quite a lot of individual differences that could impact what someone that could impact how someone views a visualization, how they might solve problems. We published a survey on this back in 2020, but I wanted to highlight one of the individual differences that keeps coming up as we explore visualization and visual analytics. And this is called locus of control. Locus of control is a personality trait, and it describes how in control you feel of external events. So someone who has internal locus of control, they feel that they can control things. They're in control of the things that are around them. And someone with external locus of control feels that things happen to them. So this is a spectrum. And what we found is, and to give you an example of this, so say for instance, someone get in a car accident, someone with internal locus of control may think, okay, they could have swerved the car, they could have avoided it, whereas someone with external locus of control might think, okay, maybe they were unlucky, this thing just happened to them just because bad things happen. And it turns out that a lot of my work has shown that this trait, which is at the first time when I started looking into this, it was a little bit weird to me that this trait correlated with speed, accuracy, search strategies, insight. This trait also predicts academic performance. There are some reports that says that some universities are actually screening people with locus of control to determine acceptance. So this definitely goes beyond visualization and visualization usage. One of the first time when we looked into locus of control, it was with this game right here. So we had the setup, and the goal of this setup was for people to find Waldo. And this was one of the first times when we tried to figure out what can we learn from interactions. And so we had people play this game. They had at that time, so the old Google Maps, we had like an old Google Map style interface where people can go up, down, left, right, zoom in, zoom out. And we logged all of the interactions as they were searching for Waldo. For this specific illustration, and I know some of you definitely would have seen illustrations like this and found and looked for Waldo. For this one, Waldo was a little bit hard to find. Oops, my animations are all over the place. Wait, give me 1 second. Okay, so Waldo was a little bit hard to find because he was hiding in the bushes. And we intentionally used this one because this is something that you have lots of distractions. So if you were looking for red and white striped shirt, then you wouldn't not normally find Waldo. And we also wanted one that was hard enough so that we can get lots of interactions that we can learn from. So as I said, we logged as people searched for Waldo. We had 90% participants who used the system searching for Waldo. People spent quite a bit of time, so the average time was close to 8 minutes. The fastest people found Waldo in 2 minutes. The slowest people found Waldo in about 14 minutes. And as I said, we captured their most interactions, but we also collected personality data. And so this was the big 5 personality traits as well as locus of control. The first thing we did to look at this data was we created a representation of people's movements through this interface. And so you can think of this kind of like a node link diagram where the nodes represents the viewport and the link represents transition between these viewports. And so very thick lines mean that someone was really zoomed out and they were making big jumps on the interface. And then very small lines mean that someone was very zoomed in and they were making small steps. So we use this to try to figure out, do we see visual differences between people with different personality traits? And one of the things that we did is we took a median split of their locus of control data. So we have externals based on this median split on the left here, and we have internals on the right. One of the things that we realized is that people who had external locus of control, they tended to zoom in and make small steps on the interface while they were searching for Waldo. They were also less likely to find Waldo, and they were just generally slower at this task. And we also then, so a part of this project was to see if we can apply off-the-shelf machine learning tools. I'm just giving an overview of of the results because I want to like go through other stuff. But we did support vector machines and decision trees, and in general, we were able to show that we can detect.
We have a question.
Yeah. Okay, so just kind of I guess two related question. One, did you do like a separate assessment to figure out if people were external locus of control or internal before the task?
Yes, that's a great question. We use standard psychological tests to measure locus of control.
I see.
So based on their scores, we were able to separate internals versus the externals.
I see. And my second question is, are people kind of bimodal that they fall in one or the other? Is it a spectrum? And is there like a situation that more people are one versus the other?
So this is a spectrum, and depending on, so we've looked at locus of control for many years. I don't have any evidence to say that like more people are one or the other. It really depends on the sample. So when we look at people who, and in the next study that I'm going to talk about, we look at people who were a part of the Department of Defense. They generally had a higher locus of control. When we capture data from Mechanical Turk, we see somewhat of a normal distribution actually.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. So this was one of the first evidence that we had that, and so the accuracy here was a 2-class classification. You see is 60%, so it's not amazing, but it's definitely better than chance. And it was the first indication that we could possibly capture individual differences. So I can figure out if someone has, with varying degrees of accuracy, extroversion, neuroticism, or locus of control, just based on looking at their interactions, looking for Waldo. So we've since done multiple studies that kind of like just shown that locus of control, this trait keeps popping up. Like, for example, another study that we did with some intelligence analysts from the Laboratory of Analytic Sciences. So they were all Navy reservists with training. One of the things that we did is that we had them do a somewhat more complex task. So Waldo was the first indication, but with Waldo, it was just a visual search task. It was pretty simple. Most people can do it, which is also why we chose it in the first place. But we wanted to test some of these theories or hypotheses rather with a more complex task. And so we use a task from the VAST Challenge of 2014. So the VAST Challenge is this annual challenge we have in our community, and it's really meant to get data through partnerships with government agencies. And so these are supposed to be more complex data that represent real world scenarios that we also can use in the visualization community as test beds for the things that we develop. So with this specific VAST challenge, we had people, we built a simple interface, and we had people, they can search for articles, and there were about 1,000 articles. They can filter, and they can, and so this was also like looking for articles. I forgot to mention what the task was, sorry. The task was that there was a kidnapping that happened in this fictitious island called Kronos. And the idea here is that the analyst needed to use this interface to look through documents to try to figure out, either based on email correspondence and articles, to try and figure out who are responsible for the kidnapping, and also figure out how do you build a network based on the communications that you see. And so based on the documents they were reading, they would start building up this network. And so this was a task that they did over 2 days, 2 consecutive days. They started and then they continued the next day. As they were completing the task, we logged things like how many times they search, when they get details, the edits, add elements, and the connections that they made. And I just wanted to like spend this time to highlight some of the results because there are lots of interesting other things I want to get to. But some of the things that we saw, again, this idea of individual differences mediating behavior, we saw that internals in this situation, they were exploring more of the articles. So they explored more of the data landscape, and they interacted with more unique elements. Whereas externals, they tended to not explore as much. As I mentioned, based on the previous question, majority of the people that were in our sample had internal locus of control. And so the externals we saw just didn't explore this space as much as the internals did. So this was another evidence where we had people that are trained intelligence analysts solving a problem, and you can see the way they explore this data space was just very different. One of the things I want to touch on briefly before I move on to the other category of work that we do is this idea that it's easy for us to see these results and then maybe say, okay, maybe we shouldn't have externals, or maybe we should maybe we should screen people and only work with internals rather. But this is another project that we had, and we had two different interfaces that both represent the same data. And the idea was to see if the layout is what might be causing the differences that we are seeing. So we had participants, again, we measured their locus of control using standard psychological tests. And we had people use both of these representations. We had they had different things that we were looking for, and they used different data sets as well. But this was a within subject experiment. And one of the things that we saw was that when we gave people this indented tree, people who scored higher on the spectrum, people who were internals, they tended to perform a breadth first search with this representation. And so if you can think about what that means, it means that they kept expanding and then going back and forth. And that meant also that they were slower at performing the task than people who were externals, who tended to do just a depth first search. On the other hand, when we looked at the dendrogram, what we found was that people who were internals, when they got this, they still did a breadth first search, but this dendrogram was better suited for that type of interaction. And people who were externals, they tended to perform somewhat a random search, and they tended to get lost in the structure. They were more likely to not find what they were looking for. And so this was indication that there isn't a one size fits all. You need to understand people's personality traits first to know which representation best fits them. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next bridge. Are there any questions?
Sure. Alvitta, I have a question, which is, to what degree is locus of control or at least theorized to be a fixed personality trait versus something that might be more situational or kind of based on levels of familiarity? I'm just curious how it varies, and is that something you have to account for in these types of studies?
Thanks. This is actually a pretty great question. Generally speaking, personality traits are stable throughout someone. Once you become an adult, your personality traits are stable based on all the psychological research that I know of. But there's always a but. These things are highly complex, and one of the things that we've done is we've shown that you can actually manipulate temporarily someone's locus of control. We did this by asking people times when they did not feel in control. So for people who measured internal, we asked them to reflect on times when they didn't feel in control. And for people who were externals, we asked them to reflect on times when they felt in control and had them write those down. And what's interesting about that is after that exercise, they exhibited behavior that is related to the priming that they got. And so that suggests that, yes, a locus of control and personality trait in general are stable, but there are small manipulations that you can do.
I also have a question.
Mhm.
Question is, how about intersections of personality traits? Like it might be that, I'm an internal, but I also have other traits, and they will interact in some way that will maybe change how I'm going to use the interface.
Yeah, that's also a great question. These traits are correlated. So locus of control, as I mentioned, every time that we've seen any instances of locus of control affecting behavior, we've also seen neuroticism and extroversion. And so these are highly correlated. And so like you can enumerate lots of different things. I feel though that I've just been hesitant in general. So I pretend to be a psychologist. I'm not an actual psychologist, but I tend to hesitate to dig deeply into these traits and their subfacets because there are lots of subfacets to each one of these as well, and they're highly correlated. So I tend to just look at correlations. I'm not at all equipped to say that these are the ties are more than what we're seeing. One of the things that I've seen though is the one with locus and control keep popping up. Another thing to also consider is that these personality traits don't affect simple tasks. You have to have somewhat of a complex task in order to see any effects at all.
Thank you.
Leilani, do you want to go ahead and ask the question?
Yeah, I'll just keep mine short. I was just curious if you've looked into what happens when people with these different personality traits interact, like when internal and externals work together on a team or something to complete analysis projects, stuff like that.
That's pretty cool. I haven't looked at collaboration. I've thought a lot though about what collaboration might mean, especially if we're saying that there isn't a single representation for both people. And so if they're forced to use the same representation, perhaps one option might be to see if there's one representation that can like split the difference. But yes, I think that's a really cool idea to think about what collaborations might mean, and also what collaborations might mean, even if we are using different representations separately. How do you communicate to each other? Because the representation that you use would definitely affect how you even talk about the data. But all of these are open questions. I would love to definitely dig it deeper into some of these conversations.
Thank you.
Of course. Okay, so based on all of these observations, one of the things that we've spent a lot of the time thinking about as well is, what can I capture in real time? And so the first thing we try to do is to see if we can capture, model, and predict attention as someone is interacting with a visual analytics system. I wanted to consider this example. So this is a map of St. Louis, and this is the dots are representing crimes and where they happened in St. Louis. If you as a human observe someone zooming into this map, you might see, okay, they're zooming into this green shaded region, they're clicking on blue stuff. I might assume they might be interested in larceny in Forest Park. This green area is Forest Park. After some observations, I can update what I think. And so you see them looking at pink dots in this area. So then you might then assume, okay, maybe this person is interested in anything that happened in this area. So after looking at something like this, we asked the question, how might we develop an algorithm that can make these observations and update observations as they come in? And so this is essentially machine learning for time series data. The assumptions that we make here are that their samples arrive sequentially. We also assume that the sample size is unknown and they might vary. So I don't know how many clicks someone might do, how many times someone might hover. And we also assume that this might be different from person to person. We assume that the data are not available during training. So I can't pre-train on anything. And I also can't necessarily assume that observations that I made from one person can translate to another person, or even observations for one person, session A, can transfer to session B. I can't make that assumption at all. We also assume that waiting until time t to accumulate a batch might not be feasible. So that means also that we can't use a lot of the amazing deep learning algorithms that are out there. So what we did instead is we used a technique, a traditional machine learning technique called hidden Markov model. Historically, hidden Markov models did very well for pattern recognition and speech recognition. And so we were optimistic that this would also be helpful in a visualization setting. The first thing we needed to do is to figure out how do we apply hidden Markov models to visualization. So for a hidden Markov model, you need to define 4 things. We need to define the hidden states. And so to define the hidden states, we assume that the hidden state is associated with the visualization elements in a visualization. So for example, we would take a visualization and we would decompose it into the low-level features to create feature combinations. So for this one, we can enumerate the different colors, the different size, positions, and this can have motions and etc. And so if you're paying attention, you might realize that this can theoretically be very large, but in the space of visualization, this is bounded because the human perceptual system gets overloaded after you have like 7 different variables to consider. So it's usually best practice to have less than 7. And so this feature combination is going to be bounded, thankfully. So essentially, this hidden state is the mark space. So this is a set of features that someone might pay attention to at any given time t. And then we needed to define observations. We essentially say observations can be any kind of interaction with the visualization element. So this can be a mouse click, this can be keystroke, eye gaze. And so depending on the input device, then we can use those as observations. So any interaction with the visualization element, we observe those things. We also need to define a dynamical model. And so this is defining how attention might shift from one timestamp to another. And we assume that attention doesn't drift too far away. So your attention at time t+1 will be similar to your attention at time t with some drift. So we try to, this is informed by work in computational image processing, where there's a lot of evidence to say when someone is looking at a scene, their attention usually is related to the previous attention at the previous time step. And then finally, we needed to define the observational model. And this loosely translates to people will interact with elements that are related to the hidden space. We had one more component that we wanted to add to this, is this notion of biases. So this is saying that there are features that might be attracting someone's attention. And so we're trying to also figure out which one of these features are attracting someone's attention. So we included a bias vector to keep track of that. To make predictions, we use a technique called particle filtering. And so to give you a general idea of what this means, here I'm visualizing what the machine thinks is happening. And so this is time t=0. This is without making any kind of observations. What this representation is saying is that there are particles everywhere. So someone's attention could be anywhere. We've also have things of different colors. And so these are drawn from the underlying data set. You might realize, for instance, there are more blue dots. That's because the underlying crime data set has had more blue dots in it. So this is drawn from the distribution. You might also realize that there are some dots that don't have a color at all. And so this is saying that I'm very sure about the location of their point, but I'm not sure at all about the color. And this is where that bias comes in. To make predictions, what we do is we observe interactions. So for instance, someone clicks on that orange dot, we update the prediction. And then we might observe a brown dot, we update that prediction. We observe red dots, we update that prediction. And as we observe more red dots, we start updating the prediction. So you can see here for this specific user, this specific hypothetical user who clicked on 6 dots, we can then see that at this point, the algorithm believes that this person is interested in red things. It also believes that the location of these red things are pretty close together. And so what we do from this point, we have all of these particles vote for points on the map. So this now translates back to the map. And you might then realize that the red dots are large. And so this is representation of my belief, or the algorithm's belief, that the person is really interested in these red dots. You can also see some dots around the Forest Park region that are a little bit more opaque. And that is the algorithm saying that it believes that someone is interested in that area. So we wanted to test this model because, as you all know, all models are wrong. Some are useful. So we wanted to see how useful this model was. We want to use a study to do that, where we had 30 participants. 17 of them were women, and the average age were 33. We had them do a variety of tasks, which I'm going to explain in the next section, but we tracked their interactions, and the goal was to see how well this algorithm will do at predicting what someone would be paying attention to. So we had 3 types of tasks, and the tasks were meant to elicit behavior to kind of stress test the algorithm. So we have type-based tasks, and for example, I might tell participants to find homicides and interact with homicides anywhere on the map. We also had geo-based tasks, and this was meant to limit their interactions to a specific geographical region. So we had people interact with points in that area. And then we had the mixed task, where we told people to interact with maybe blue dots in this area. And so the idea was, again, to elicit specific behavior to see how would the algorithm do under these circumstances. So we had 30 participants, and in all, each participant did 6 tasks. And so this led to 180 trials in total. After cleaning, we had 78 trials remaining. And one thing about the accuracy, though, I want to mention. So on the x-axis here, we had the type of task. And on the y-axis, we have accuracy. In the paper, we go a lot deeper into different values of k. So the way we evaluated how accurate this algorithm was we look at different so k is the size of the prediction set. So here we're showing k equals 100, and there were about 2,000 points on the map. So here k is representing about 5% of the data set. And so we are treating it as success if at k equals 100, what someone's interact with in the next time step is within that prediction set. In our paper, we also have k equals 1, which means that the algorithm gets 1 guess. We also have k equal 5, 10, 50, but we thought 100 was a good number to settle on, because that means that if I'm supposed to, for instance, try to filter some of the data set down, then 5% of the data seems a reasonable goal. And so here we see overall the algorithm actually did pretty well at predicting someone's attention for the next time step, and at an average of 95%. And we also wanted to look to see how the algorithm would perform over time. And it turns out that in a lot of the cases, after looking at 4 observations, it had a fairly high accuracy rate for predicting someone's attention for K, again, equal 100. To summarize, we created a framework for representing, modeling, and predicting latent attention. And with this framework, we also demonstrated that this model can accurately predict attention and interactions before they occur.
Actually, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question. I'm actually confused about what you are predicting exactly when you're predicting attention. Is the model predicting where the person is looking and what color dots they're looking at? Like what's the actual prediction?
Yes. So I would say, so the algorithm is able to say that, so you asked where they're looking. We don't have eye tracking data. We were looking at mouse click data. So I can predict what someone would click on next, and I am predicting where it is. In this specific instance, it's where it is and the color it is. Those are the 2 variables that are being represented in the visualization.
Oh, I see. Okay, thank you. So then it seems like if you're predicting up to K equals 100, then there's probably kind of some location and some colors people are interested in. So those 100 will probably be something around where they currently are, right? Assuming that their attention will just drift a little bit. Or do you also see people like jumping across?
Yes, it would definitely jump across, especially when you're looking at a type-based. So the types can be all over the place. And so you see lots of jumping in terms of location. And so that's why we have that bias vector. But having looked at this algorithm, it actually doesn't do, well, maybe it does a good job. So what I realize is when the algorithm is trying to predict type, a lot of times it just uses location because, and Leilani actually saw this in one of the work that she did, and that people just tended to explore close by. So even if I'm looking for like something of a specific type, the first thing I'm going to look at is the type that is closest. So it turns out that the algorithm has also learned that just location is a good enough proxy for predicting what someone is going to interact with next.
Thank you.
By location, do you mean that for K equals to 100, do you just guess 100 dots and then say that they're going to click on one of these dots, or you have some little square saying that they're going to click in this area and then you have 100 little squares? So if it falls in those squares, then yeah. So what do you mean by location?
So if the way the algorithm does, because sorry, let me go back to this one. So the particles have a specific location. And so what they do is to vote for the dot that is closest to the location. So it's not necessarily like a square or anything like that. Each particle gets to vote based on their specific locations. And so you can see very irregular patterns of the dots that are being predicted. Okay, so I want to touch on the final project. I'm going to skip over projects where we were comparing the different models because it's not as exciting as the final project, in my opinion. But here, one of the things that we're trying to do is we are looking at how might making suggestions impact people's exploration. And so here, what we aim to do is we wanted to, with these algorithms that we've created, so in our lab, we've created multiple algorithms. The one I showed was for predicting attention. We have a different algorithm that uses Bayesian model selection to predict exploration bias. So it predicts the biases in attributes for the data set. And so given the sets of algorithms that we had, we wanted to see how might we use these algorithms to make suggestions. For this last project, we also use another vast challenge. And this vast challenge was, I think it was 2011, yes. And the scenario here was that there was a terrorist attack, a bioterrorist attack on a bridge. So someone exploded a truck, and some of the chemicals got into the water. So you had people downstream that had gastrointestinal symptoms, and you had some of the chemicals getting in the air. And so people in the downtown area started having flu-like symptoms and upper respiratory symptoms. And the scenario here is that authorities are realizing that there are a lot of people going to the hospital, and they're trying to understand, is this epidemic contained, or should this be something that they need to send out contact traces for to understand what's going on? So with this scenario, we embedded suggestions. So as we're observing people are exploring this data, we start making suggestions for what they might explore next based on the observations that we've seen. We ran a study where we had two groups of participants. We had a control group, and we're calling the active search group. So this is the active search, where they had the active search algorithm embedded into the platform. We gave people 10 minutes to search. So this data set had more than 1 million tweets. So we needed to bound people's exploration, because there was no way that they can solve this task in the allotted time. So one of the things that we found out, and so on the x-axis here, we have time. On the y-axis, we have the number of microblogs, aka tweets, that they discovered. And we saw, somewhat as expected, the group that had suggestions found more people that required contact tracing, and the group that didn't have the suggestions found less of it. So we saw an advantage to having that algorithm helping them look for more people as based on the observations. One of the other things that we saw was that for the control group, they actually hovered on more things. So when we look at hovers per minute, there was a statistically significant difference between the number of hovers that we observed in the control group. So this is people without the machine learning suggestions. But people in the active search group, they hovered on more relevant things. And so people in the active search group, with the help of the algorithm, they were able to essentially ignore the irrelevant tweets and focus more on the relevant tweets. So we saw that the machine learning algorithm was indeed advantageous to this search. One of the things that was surprising, though, is so here on the x-axis, we have recommendation usage. And so this is the percentage of recommendations that someone may have used. And what we saw was that a non-trivial amount of our participants just ignore the recommendations completely. We looked into the accuracy of these recommendations and found no evidence. Overall, the algorithm itself was accurate, but people just didn't interact with them. We also asked people about their trust. And so this was a simple question of how much did you trust the suggestions? And we found that the people who didn't interact with the suggestions at all were more likely to say that they didn't trust them. So this was the first indication of us realizing that even though you might invest and you build tools that theoretically could be helpful, lots of, whoa, sorry, I don't know what just happened. Oh, I know what happened, sorry. My mic pressed the keyboard. Okay. Oh, wait, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so even though you invest time, money to build algorithms that could be used, that theoretically could be useful, there are people who might not use them. I also want to look back at this chart again, because I think it's also equally problematic to see that there's some people who just use all of the suggestions. And so right now we're really interested in this idea of looking at how do you help someone calibrate trust, which leads into some of the work that we're doing right now. So my current and future work. And so this is just building on the previous study that we did, where we see some tendency for distrust and some tendency for blind trust. We're looking at how do we help someone calibrate trust. We're also thinking about how do you use explanations to facilitate that. One of the problems that we're working on right now is in partnership with the Department of Defense. And what they're interested in is this space of people who might see machine learning transcripts of audio, and oftentimes their audio transcripts actually don't tell you the confidence of those transcripts. And so how do you get someone to listen to the audio when needed and trust the machine learning output when appropriately? And so we're looking at how do you display confidence values, and how do you help someone calibrate trust based on the confidence values. I'm also very much interested in supporting decision-making for medical decisions. And some of the stuff that we're working on right now is thinking about the mixture of text and visualization. We're also thinking about working memory capacity. So that is another individual trait. Well, it's more of a cognitive ability rather. So people have varying levels of working memory capacity. And so we're really interested in how working memory capacity might mediate both your performance and preference when there's text versus visualization versus when they're combined. I'm also excited about some of the recent work that we're doing in the space of visualization literacy. So some of the things that I've done in the past where we've talked to people when we're communicating medical statistics. So some of the work that I've done have to do with prostate cancer, and we interact with a lot of aged men. And one of the things that we realize is that some of them actually struggle with using visualizations. And so we actually wanted to develop a test to see, to test whether or not someone can read a visualization. There are existing tools out there. The one that we built on called VLAT, it has 50-something questions associated with it. It takes almost a half an hour to complete it. And so this is the work that we submitted to Euroviz. I'm very optimistic that it's going to get in and get really high ratings. And we developed a 12-question visualization literacy test. It takes about 5 minutes to do, and is very accurate in measuring whether or not someone can read a chart. I'm also excited in the intersection. I'm really excited about the intersection of trust and visualization design. And so, can someone trust the design? Is it appropriate to even ask that question? I'll let you know in a few months. But this is like embarking in some ethnographic studies to look at the relationship between the visualization design and trust perception. And I mentioned earlier that I've been collaborating with some scientists who have high dimensional data. So we're looking at how do we expand the visual system. And this is looking at sound and thinking about how we might use augmented reality to explore high dimensional data spaces and facilitate collaborations in these areas. Because I want to just have a little bit of time for questions, I'm going to just thank my collaborators again, so thank my students and also everyone that I've collaborated with. Thank you to their funding agencies. Work has been funded by the Department of Defense, NSF, and Boeing. And I am now happy to take any questions.